The cold wind cut through the bustling city streets as Alexander Carter leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand. The dim glow of the high-end bar cast shadows over his chiseled features, his sharp blue eyes filled with the confidence of a man who had seen and conquered it all. A self-made millionaire before the age of 30, he had built his empire from the ground up, turning failed investments into gold with a touch that seemed almost magical. But wealth had come with its own price. A life surrounded by opportunists, shallow socialites, and an endless stream of meaningless challenges from men who envied him. That night, a challenge unlike any other had found its way to his table. Seated across from him were three of his closest acquaintances: Brandon, a real estate tycoon with a competitive streak; Lucas, a well-known entrepreneur who thrived on risky bets; and Daniel, an old friend who had known Alexander before the fortune and fame. Their conversations often revolved around business, luxury, and women. But tonight, Lucas had a mischievous glint in his eye. "You think you've mastered everything, Alex?" Lucas smirked, leaning forward. "You've got the money, the looks, the charm. But tell me, could you handle something truly unpredictable?" Alexander arched an eyebrow. "I don't back down from challenges. You know that." Brandon chuckled. "Good, because we have a bet for you. Something outside your usual comfort zone." Alexander took a sip of his drink, waiting. Lucas leaned in, his voice lowering just enough to make it sound like a well-kept secret. "Marry the woman everyone despises." A slow silence settled over the table. Alexander let out a short laugh. "That's it? That's the challenge?" "You don't get it," Daniel said, shaking his head. "We're talking about the most disliked woman in the city. The one everyone avoids. The one nobody even spares a second glance." Lucas grinned, seeing the curiosity in Alexander's eyes. "She's stubborn, rude, completely uninterested in society. People whisper about her, make fun of her. She's got no charm, no social standing. No man would willingly pursue her." Alexander tilted his head. "And why exactly would I do this?" Brandon's smirk widened. $1 million says you won't last 6 months as her husband. $1 million. Nothing more than pocket change to Alexander. But it wasn't about the money. It was about the challenge, the thrill of proving people wrong. And maybe, just maybe, a hint of curiosity. What was it about this woman that made everyone despise her so much? He leaned back, his mind already working through the possibilities. "What's her name?" Lucas exchanged glances with the others before saying, "Eleanor Monroe." The name lingered in the air, heavy with unsaid stories. Eleanor Monroe, the woman people crossed the street to avoid. The woman whispered about in hushed voices at social gatherings. Rumors painted her as cold, arrogant, and difficult. A woman with a past shrouded in mystery. Alexander's lips curved into a slow, confident smile. "I'll do it." His friends exchanged amused looks, already picturing the disaster that would unfold. But what none of them knew was that Eleanor Monroe was far more than the rumors that surrounded her. She was about to change Alexander's life in ways he never could have imagined. The next morning, Alexander Carter found himself parked outside a small bookstore at the quieter end of the city. He tapped his fingers against the leather steering wheel of his car, his mind still processing what he was about to do. The woman everyone despised, Eleanor Monroe. He had expected to find her in some run-down apartment or a neglected part of town, but instead, her address had led him here. An old bookstore with faded signage and dusty windows, wedged between a bakery and an antique shop. He stepped out, adjusting the sleeves of his tailored suit, and pushed open the door. A soft bell chimed overhead. The scent of aged paper and ink filled the air, a stark contrast to the polished modern world he was used to. At first, the shop seemed empty. Then, from behind a tall shelf stacked with novels, a voice spoke. "We're not hiring." Alexander turned in the direction of the voice and found her, Eleanor Monroe. She wasn't what he had expected, not unattractive, but far from the elegant women he was used to being surrounded by. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy bun, and a pair of glasses sat low on her nose. She wore a simple sweater, sleeves slightly pushed up, as if she had been working all morning. There was no forced politeness, no fake smile, just a woman who seemed uninterested in whoever had just walked through her door. "I'm not here for a job," Alexander said, slipping his hands into his pockets. "I'm here for you." She glanced up from the book she had been flipping through, raising an unimpressed eyebrow. "Try another line. That one's terrible." A smirk played at the corner of his lips. She was blunt. He'd give her that. "I want to marry you." Silence. Eleanor let out a short laugh, shaking her head as she closed the book in her hands. "You're joking." "I'm not." She studied him now, as if trying to figure out whether he was insane or just stupid. "I don't even know you." "Alexander Carter," he said smoothly. "I assume you've heard of me." Her lips pressed together, her expression unreadable. "Oh, I've heard of you." She crossed her arms. "Why would someone like you want to marry someone like me?" It was a fair question, but he had no intention of telling her about the bet. Instead, he met her gaze and said, "Because I think you're more interesting than people give you credit for." She tilted her head, her sharp eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. "That's a nice way of saying I'm some kind of project for you." Alexander exhaled slowly. She wasn't making this easy, but then again, why would she? He was standing in her space, offering something ridiculous, and yet something told him she wasn't completely shutting him out. "What do you have to lose?" he asked. "Let's call it an arrangement. You get financial security, a change of pace, and I get," he paused, measuring his words, "the opportunity to prove that people have been wrong about you." She tapped her fingers against the book she held. "Considering 6 months," she finally said. "No more." A satisfied smile spread across Alexander's face. 6 months, she sighed, shaking her head as if she already regretted it. "Fine, but don't think for a second that I'll make this easy for you." Alexander chuckled. "I wouldn't expect anything less." And just like that, the deal was made. But what he didn't know was that Eleanor Monroe was about to teach him a lesson that no amount of money or power could have prepared him for. The wedding was a quiet affair. No grand celebrations, no extravagant displays of wealth. Just a simple exchange of vows at the courthouse, witnessed by a clerk who barely looked up from his paperwork. Eleanor wore a modest dress, nothing flashy, and Alexander, ever the businessman, stuck to a crisp suit. There were no heartfelt speeches or loving gazes, just an agreement sealed with a signature. To the world, it was an unusual pairing, one that sparked whispers and speculation. Why would a man like Alexander Carter, a self-made millionaire, marry a woman who had spent years keeping herself at the margins of society? Eleanor didn't care for the rumors. She had spent her whole life being misunderstood, and she wasn't about to explain herself now. She continued running her bookstore, and Alexander, busy with his business empire, barely saw her beyond shared dinners that often ended in arguments rather than conversation. They were two opposites forced together, bound by a deal that neither seemed fully invested in. But something unexpected began to happen. Alexander, used to controlling everything in his life, found himself unraveling in Eleanor's presence. She was not impressed by his wealth, nor did she seek his approval. She was independent in ways that made him question everything he had known about relationships. She had her own mind, her own ambitions, and her own way of living that didn't revolve around luxury or power. And yet, beneath her sharp exterior, he saw something else, a deep kindness, a quiet strength that fascinated him. Eleanor, in turn, started to see the cracks in the polished image of Alexander Carter. Behind the confidence and charm was a man, burdened by expectations, a man who had spent his entire life proving himself, chasing success without ever stopping to ask why. He had everything, yet somehow he seemed lost. Their cold arrangement began to thaw. The forced conversations turned into late-night talks over cups of tea, where Eleanor challenged his beliefs, made him question his choices. She didn't treat him like the rest of the world did, with either admiration or envy. She simply saw him for who he was, not what he had. And for the first time in his life, Alexander felt truly seen. But just as he began to realize what she meant to him, their 6 months were coming to an end. One evening, as they sat in the bookstore, surrounded by shelves stacked with stories, Eleanor finally spoke the words neither of them had dared to say. "Our deal is almost over." Alexander's chest tightened. He had spent months thinking he was in control of this arrangement, that he could walk away unchanged. But now, the thought of losing her felt unbearable. "I don't want it to be over," he admitted. Eleanor sighed, looking down at the book in her hands. "Then what do you want, Alexander?" He had spent his whole life making decisions with his head, calculating risks and rewards. But for the first time, he didn't have a strategy, only a feeling that he couldn't ignore. "I want you," he said quietly. "Not as a bet, not as an arrangement, just you." Eleanor studied him, her expression unreadable. "And what if I say no?" He swallowed. "Then I'll walk away, but not because I want to." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Then, Eleanor closed the book in her hands and stood. She walked toward him, stopping just close enough for him to see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "You're an idiot," she murmured. A slow smile spread across his face. "I know," she sighed, shaking her head. But before she could say anything else, he reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. For the first time, there were no deals, no expectations, just the simple, undeniable truth he had accepted. A bet to marry the woman everyone despised. But in the end, she had given him something far more valuable than money. She had taught him what it meant to truly love,